Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Reinhartz. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the American Society of University of Haifa. I'm based in Miami. It's wonderful to have so many viewers today on Zoom and Facebook Live from really across the United States and around the world for this very important conversation. We're so appreciative that you've joined us. This is the second in our three-part series called Israel and World Jewry in a Time of Crisis. This series is being hosted by the acclaimed law firm Saul Ewing, and it's an honor for me today to introduce today's guest speaker, former U.S. envoy to the Middle East, Ambassador Dennis Ross. We've all heard of him, read his work, heard him speak, and now you'll have a very important conversation with him, with our board member and a partner at Saul Ewing, Jeff Robbins. As the point person for the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and the Bill Clinton administrations, Ambassador Ross is a trusted and revered voice in what is arguably the most controversial geopolitical conflict of our time. He is a figure who played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process. Among a long list of credentials, Ambassador Ross helped to orchestrate the 1995 interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, commonly known as Oslo II, the 1997 Hebron Agreement, and the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. He served as the Special Middle East Coordinator under President Bill Clinton and was the Director of Policy and Planning in the State Department under President George H.W. Bush. In addition to dedicating most of his career, or much of his career, I guess, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Ambassador Ross was a special assistant to President Barack Obama and was the National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, where he spent the first 6 months of the administration as Special Advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Today, Ambassador Ross is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he co-chairs the Jewish People Policy Institute's board of directors. He will be interviewed today in conversation with Jeff Robbins, and we're thrilled to have Jeff back as well as a moderator of this series. Today's webinar will highlight Ambassador Ross sharing his perspective on the current Israeli-Hamas war, the state of U.S.-Israeli relations, and what a path to peace post-October 7th and post this war would look like. Before I hand you over to Jeff, I want to take this opportunity to welcome back our supporters of ASUH and of University of Haifa. With the university opening its doors and resuming studies nearly 3 months ago on December 31st, following a delayed start to the academic year due to the ongoing war with Hamas in Gaza, it has served as a catalyst for healing between Israel's different ethnic and religious communities. As Israel's most diverse campus, with 40% of the student body consisting of Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Bedouins, for 50 years, the University of Haifa has played and will continue to play a central role in ensuring that all sectors of the Israeli population unite to nurture their beautifully diverse civic society. This role is proving more important than ever, with the university establishing a paradigm for healing throughout Israeli society. To support us in this mission, please visit asuh.org/donate. And together we can ensure that University of Haifa continues our inspired efforts to heal Israeli society from its darkest hour. Over the past 5 months, we've had 1,500 students and 50 faculty members serving in the reserves, including 300 students in the security forces. University of Haifa has ensured that it provides support to the brave student soldiers who are serving and defending our country through financial assistance, psychological aid, relief to displaced families, and more. Earlier this month, the university announced that it will offer streamlined admissions and extra financial aid for IDF reserve soldiers, security personnel, and civilians who are directly affected by the war. This special admissions route is a unique, first-of-its-kind track for students who are starting the next academic year, and it will include fast-track acceptance to certain programs and also a scholarship of $2,000 for qualified students. Without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Ross and Jeff Robbins to our listeners today. Please, as always, put your name, your location, and your connection to University of Haifa in the chat on Zoom and on Facebook Live, and put your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the webinar for your questions. If we can't get to all your questions, I apologize, but we usually have hundreds of questions, so it's hard, but we'll do our best to address them. And again, we'll be sharing the recording of this webinar in the coming days with all of you. So Jeff, on to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Naomi. And let me add to Naomi's thanks, Ambassador Ross. There's nobody in the best of times, in ordinary times, who's better regarded or more widely demanded for commentary on the Middle East than you. And these days, I just can assume that I can hope that you're eating from the 4 food groups, given the schedule that you are maintaining. You are the rare, if not the singular person who has observed at close range the machinations, the tensions, the frustrations, and the intricacies of the relationship between American presidents and Israeli prime ministers. And for good measure, you're a scholarly authority on the relationship, having written the book, for example, Doomed to Succeed, an account of the relationship between the two countries from Truman to Obama. How does the current acrimony, or apparent acrimony, the very apparent acrimony, between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu compare with the history of tense periods between the two countries' leaders prior to this, from the Suez Crisis to the Carter-Begin rift over the Palestinians, to the Reagan-Shamir dispute over loan guarantees, right up through Obama-Netanyahu on Iran? How does this factor in? How serious is it? And where do you place this particular period in the history of that relationship?
Well, first, good to be with you. It's always good to be with you, Jeff. So I'm happy to be doing this. And not surprisingly, you're posing a very good question. And I am someone who's thought a lot about this, as you indicate. I like to put it in perspective. I mean, if you bring in the Suez 1956-57, you had Eisenhower wanting to impose sanctions on Israel. And of course, this is a time when we didn't even have a serious relationship. We provided no arms to Israel at all, notwithstanding many requests from David Ben-Gurion. We frankly provided no real assistance. And so the Eisenhower administration was one that did everything it could to distance itself from Israel. I think if we put this in a more contemporary context, meaning at a time when you had a very different kind of relationship between the United States and Israel, which really begins during the Reagan administration, people tend to look at Nixon and Kissinger because of the 1973 war. But even the 1973 war, we didn't provide anything to Israel for the first week of the war, even though Israel had lost 800 tanks and 1/3 of its air force. We were providing nothing. In the case of Ronald Reagan, who really is the first administration, the first president who tends to transform the relationship, during the summer of 1982, on 5 separate occasions, he threatened the future of the relationship with Israel. You know, we're talking about something qualitatively different than what we're seeing now. And even what we're seeing now, already Prime Minister Netanyahu has, after having delayed or having called back his delegation, which, by the way, there was already, the Minister of Defense was here with his delegation, and guess what? He was seeing the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, and guess what they were talking about? What you do in Rafah. So this was a symbolic move by Prime Minister Netanyahu. If you ask me, why did he do it? Even though there was an abstention on a Security Council resolution, which was, by the way, a non-binding resolution, a resolution that called for a ceasefire only for the remaining days of Ramadan, not a permanent ceasefire, and which made it clear there needed to be called for an unconditional release of the hostages. So the content wasn't terrible, but I have to admit, when you abstain on a Security Council resolution, you're also basically establishing a kind of threshold that you're prepared to cross. And that explains part of the reason for the Netanyahu response, which, by the way, he's already announced that he's asking to send the delegation. So even the one that was called back, he's now saying, can we reschedule it? So I wouldn't get carried away with what we're seeing right now, but one has to be fair. There are genuine concerns here. You have an administration with President Biden who has gone to great lengths, previously vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions, did a great deal to support Israel at some cost to us, at certainly a political cost to himself, has provided nonstop military resupply, much more than people are aware of. And he has done things at some political cost to him, and it's not so clear in his mind that Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be willing to do things at political cost to himself. In fact, I would say part of the reason for why he called back this delegation was to show ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that he was reacting to what the administration had done. So, are these difficult times? For sure, they're difficult times. Do you have a president who's the only American president who ever called himself a Zionist? We have no other American president who called himself a Zionist. This president has. Is he going to break with Israel? No, he's not going to break with Israel. But he has wondered, legitimately so, why it is so difficult for Israel to be making it easier to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which, by the way, makes it easier for us to provide Israel the time and space they need to achieve their military objectives. And he wonders why, when he gets a commitment from the prime minister to deliver flour, it takes 2 months for that to happen. So, he has some legitimate questions that he's raising, even though he understands that Israel is, as a result of October 7th, is still in what I would call a post-traumatic stress syndrome reality. And he's mindful of that. So, yeah, this is a difficult time. When it comes to the information war, Israel's not winning the information war. It is succeeding militarily, but it has not developed what is a credible day-after approach, which is one of the reasons that Israel's had to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital after having cleared it before. A real day-after strategy is one that also ensures you don't leave a vacuum. And so there's some legitimate issues and questions, but I still put them in a context. You have a president who fundamentally is supportive of Israel, sympathetic to Israel, quite mindful of Israel's predicament, but not indifferent to what's happening on the ground to Palestinians in Gaza.
What would a credible day after approach look like, or what could it look like from your perspective?
Well, it has to, I coined early on, the real issue are the days and months before the day after, because this is not a light switch where you flip it and suddenly this is over and now you have a day after. But a credible strategy for not leaving a vacuum, because that's the real issue. If Israel succeeds militarily in dismantling Hamas, that's not the end result that is required if there's a vacuum that's left that allows Hamas to make a comeback. So the strategy has to be one that has the following elements to it. First, create a delivery system for humanitarian assistance, both in terms of amount, but also security for distribution, so that you can begin to change the humanitarian reality on the ground. Now, when I say a security system for distribution, that means there has to be an approach to who is providing security so that you don't have a replay of what we've seen, which means a replay of where you have hordes descending on trucks because there hasn't been food available, and then you end up with a catastrophe. You don't have Hamas diverting the humanitarian assistance for their own purposes. You don't have people with guns who can go in and sort of seize it. So you actually have to plan for that. Now, the IDF has not wanted to play that role. It may have to do more than it's done up until now. There may be, if you take a look, there are some hopeful, I would say, examples of things being done. The Emirates have both a field hospital and 4 automated bakeries that they have put in Gaza. They provide the security for those. It's in coordination with the Israelis. So here is an example of something you can begin to create areas where there is that kind of security for distribution. But so the first thing is you have to deal with the humanitarian question in a way that it hasn't been sufficiently dealt with up until now. The second is you need to have Palestinians who have been evacuated to the south, and now 1.4 million are in the Rafah area. They need to be able to return to where they were, but then, meaning in the north, but then what's required is you need to provide prefabricated housing, caravans, large number of tents. I mean, in other words, even now when we're talking about Rafah and the people who need to be evacuated from there, it's not an evacuation plan if where they go, they can't be absorbed because there is no shelter, there is no food, there is no medicine, and so forth. So that too has to be developed. I do believe, I would like to see, I have proposed that we set up a humanitarian board. And this humanitarian board can be part of the bridge to the future. The humanitarian board should be us, should be the Gulf states, should be the Europeans. There should be a kind of division of labor among all of us in terms of who is providing what. Part of that should be, if need be, if the Israelis, and I understand why they don't want to be providing security for that, but then maybe you go to contractors. Blackwater has a bad name, but the Emirates have used contractors in different places where they've been, and the contractors themselves can be hiring Palestinians who are non-Hamas. And there were Palestinians who had security training, several thousand of them, who in fact could probably be employed for this purpose. There's also an additional value in having non-Hamas Palestinians being seen as the ones who are responsible for distributing the assistance and getting some credit for it. Now, you need not just the kind of Palestinians I was just describing, you need something else. There are about 40 to 50,000 Palestinian bureaucrats in Gaza who have a functional non-political role. They were established by the Palestinian Authority. They stayed doing the day-to-day realities, whether it's, providing electricity, healthcare, sometimes food distribution, the day-to-day realities. They were there starting with the Palestinian Authority. They've been there under Hamas. They're not politically identified. They're functional. So the COGAT already is working with them. COGAT is the coordinator of government activities in the West Bank, and they used to be obviously in Gaza as well. So they're already working with them. You have Palestinian business people who can be part of this. This humanitarian board should have a relationship with the Palestinians who have this functional responsibility, should have a relationship with Palestinian businessmen so that you can actually begin to have a resumption of some commercial activity. This can provide you, because you're going to have at least a number of the Gulf states and Egypt and Jordan as part of this board, you can begin to have a role for the Arabs and some Palestinians on an interim basis. There has to be reform of the Palestinian Authority. Every time I hear, you don't want the Palestinian Authority to come back, it's understandable today. They have to be reformed because they have no credibility in the West Bank. But there has to be, with serious reform, in a year or so, or maybe 12 to 18 months, they could come back into Gaza. The point here is there has to be an alternative to Hamas. And the idea that, you'll use the clans, nice idea, but it's not workable. So the point is, if you're going to have a credible alternative to Hamas, it's going to have to be a Palestinian one. You can probably build a bridge, and I think there could be an Arab role. It's not going to happen until Israel gets to what I call phase 4, what they call, I shouldn't say I call, they call phase 4, which is the point where they withdraw their forces from Gaza, but keep a narrow buffer around the kibbutzim. So this creates a pathway for you. Now, if there's over time, if there's a deal, a normalization deal between the Saudis and the Israelis, the Saudis are going to say, we need something that we view as being credible and different than what's happened before on the Palestinians. And in the context of having a regional strategy, a regional coalition that allows Israel to have partners for dealing with all of the Iranian proxies, consider that today Israel is facing basically 7 fronts on its own. That's not what the future should be. And there's the potential not for that to be the future. But I'm laying out for you what can be a pathway even beyond, gets to the days before the day after, and then the day after, and then a pathway that gives you more of a political horizon. You are more likely to sustain an Arab involvement if there's a bridge to a reformed Palestinian Authority, and there's also a pathway that they can see leads somewhere. I will say more about this because I want to say more about how to think about a Palestinian state. It is premature to talk, it's premature to think that there can be a Palestinian state anytime soon, but I want to talk about what would make it something that becomes more acceptable.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. It was a phrase you didn't use until the very end.
Right.
You are the person who spearheaded the closest thing we have ever had to a two-state solution, as recounted, for example, in your book, The Missing Piece. Forget about where things stood before October 7th.
Yeah.
Is talk of a Palestinian state in the near term, given October 7th, a pie in the sky stuff that has to be incanted for political reasons domestically and diplomatic reasons elsewhere? Or is that something that actually does or could have legs, even if not the day after, but 5 years after? What would have to happen in order to bring that about? And what would that look like conceivably in the near future?
Okay, so let me, this is not a short answer to a very
use
good
number two
question,
pencil, take your time, and good luck.
I will I will try to encapsulate it in the following way. Number one, for those who say there can't be a Palestinian state, they have to offer something in its place. Because if there isn't a Palestinian state, then we're talking about a one-state outcome. And a one-state outcome is not an outcome. One state is a prescription for an endless conflict. And it's a prescription for an endless conflict because we have two national movements and two national identities competing for the same space. They will not be satisfied in one state. That's simply a fact. They will not be satisfied in one state. The Palestinian national identity is not going to disappear. Now, if one state is not the answer, but producing a Palestinian state anytime soon is also not the answer, because at this point, Israelis believe a Palestinian state would mean it would be run by Hamas. And Israelis are going to need to see through performance and demonstration that that's not the case. But there's also something else here. What is required is an understanding that a Palestinian state, if a Palestinian state isn't structured in a way, doesn't have benchmarks, doesn't have performance standards that ensure, number one, that it can't be led by Hamas or extremist groups. There can't be a Palestinian state if it's going to be led by Hamas. There can't be a Palestinian state if it's going to be a part of the Iranian axis of resistance, what they call the axis of resistance, what I call the axis of misery. There can't be a Palestinian state if it's not committed to coexistence, genuine coexistence, or if it's a source of instability. There can't be a Palestinian state if it doesn't have the institutions, and will be a failed state. So what I've just suggested is you have to have an approach that creates a series of benchmarks for performance. Now, to be fair, it can't be that you have a series of requirements for the Palestinians, you have none for Israel. Especially, you look at the current government you have, which wants to ensure there can never be a Palestinian state. So you can't have Israel engaging in actions that makes a Palestinian state impossible ever. You can say there has to be performance, there have to be these benchmarks, but it can't be one-sided. And if a one-state outcome is basically a prescription for an endless conflict, and in addition to what I've said, just look at the Middle East. Every place where there's more than one identity in a state, that's a state that's at war with itself or completely paralyzed or failing. If you want these resident Palestinians to look like Libya, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, or even Iraq, then you say, let's have one state. We are not in a post-nationalism phase in the Middle East. So there has to be a sense of realism. And for all those who say there can never be a Palestinian state, they never tell you what's going to take its place. The idea that you can keep things as they are and everything will be fine is a complete illusion. Actually, it's fantasy. So the point is, create a process or a structure that also has within it a set of requirements. I mean, I wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs where one of the things I laid out was there are a series of obligations that Palestinians are going to have to meet. In addition to the ones I said, when I said to commit to coexistence, one of the things the Palestinians have to do is they have to finally acknowledge the historic Jewish connection to the land. And the reason they have to do that is because this is what indicates accepting Israel not as a fact, but in its legitimacy. It has a right to be there. Now, if you're asking the Palestinians to accept that Israel has a right to be there, you also have to have the Israelis acknowledge that the Palestinians have a right to a state. But having a right to a state doesn't mean they have a right to a state without responsibilities. They have responsibilities at the same time. They have to fulfill those responsibilities. If you can create an approach in which you identify what those responsibilities are, and you create standards of performance for that, then you can get to the point where Israelis can look at it and say, you know what? Yeah, they can be our neighbor. We can live with them. But there are requirements that have to cut both ways. The idea that there was ever going to be peace without mutual responsibility was also always an illusion.
So you mentioned Iran, and again, this is something else that you know as much about as anybody else on the planet, given the role that you've played warning about it, about Iran as the sort of malign elephant in the room of the Middle East. It's flush with cash, courtesy in part of the sanctions relief post 2015. It's funding Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. Although it doesn't seem to get much attention, it would seem to have the ability to actually procure a deployable nuclear weapon in relatively short order. And it's supplying Vladimir Putin with drones and other weapons. Apart from that, it's a source of great optimism. How do you regard this problem? What is, at this point, is the role that the U.S. and the West, and perhaps with its allies, some of its allies in the Middle East, the role that it can be playing to reduce the threat and the damage that Iran does?
You are absolutely right about the role that Iran is playing. Iran may not create the conflicts in the region, but it seeks to exploit every one of them. It uses proxies as a device to coerce, intimidate, and to undermine. And it is a nuclear weapons threshold state now. It doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but it is putting itself in a position where increasingly it will have the option for it. I am not one who believes in, that we should contain Iran with nuclear weapons after the fact. Because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then the Saudis will get nuclear weapons. Turkey will get nuclear weapons. Egypt will get nuclear weapons. And the Middle East is the idea that the balance of terror, which was never as stable as people thought it was, that it would be stable in a Middle Eastern context, where conflict is the norm, not the exception, where you wouldn't have secure second strike capabilities, where use or lose would be the mindset. That's way too dangerous. We'd have a nuclear war at some point if that's the approach. So we have to approach this from a couple of standpoints. One is also to recognize the history. And Jeff, you'll be glad to know I'm finishing a new book. I know you like to read them all.
I do.
And the new book is called Statecraft 2.0. And I've just finished a chapter applying a framework of statecraft to what our policy towards Iran should be. One of the interesting things I did in the chapters, I looked at every administration since the emergence of the Islamic Republic in the Carter administration, and I looked at who affected their behavior. I'm not saying change them strategically, because you're not going to change them strategically, but who got them to make tactical adjustments. And I won't rehearse all that now, but I'll tell you the one consistent pattern that is repeated over and over again. When the Iranians fear that force could be used against them, they adjust their behavior. When they fear that the price that they will pay is high as they measure that price, they adjust their behavior. Do they change who they are? No. Do they adjust their behavior? Yes. And I could give you, it goes back to Khomeini actually ended the war with Iraq after we reflagged ships in the Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War, destroyed their small boats and their larger boats, oil platforms, inadvertently shot down a civilian airliner, and suddenly he decided that, you know, a war that he said he would fight forever, they decided they would end the war. In the 1990s, they stopped killing Iranian dissidents in Europe when they were threatened with sanctions. In 2003, actually in 2001, they cooperated with us on Afghanistan after 9/11 because they were worried about what we might do. In 2003, when we were able to remove Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks and effectively defeated the Iraqi military in 3 weeks, and they couldn't defeat it in 8.5 years. Suddenly, they were offering through a letter that was drafted, delivered by the Swiss. They were offering to end their support for Hezbollah and Hamas, turn it purely into political support, offering to be completely transparent on the nuclear issue and to take a step back. And the Bush administration thought this was an indication of how desperate they were, so we chose not to pursue it. When things turned much worse in Iraq, suddenly they no longer had an interest in this. Even more recently, I won't do all the chapter and verse, but 2 more recent examples. One after Soleimani was killed during the Trump administration, a targeted killing, and there were all these predictions that this was going to set the region on fire. Guess what? It didn't. And after we lost 3 people at Tower 22 on February 2nd, after there'd been 166 attacks against our presence in Iraq and Syria, we waited 3 days and then we hit 85 targets, qualitatively changing the character of our responses. Suddenly, the head of the Quds forces, Ismail Qani, goes to Baghdad and tells all the Shia militias in Baghdad to stop. We were attacked 166 times between October 7th and February 2nd. And since February 2nd, when we attacked 3 days later, there has not been a single attack against our forces in Iraq or Syria. So what does that tell you? Now, the Houthis are continuing because, again, they don't see it as a threat to them. So the point here is there is a track record here in terms of they make a very rational calculus when it comes to what they see as being a threat. We need, to answer your question, now that I've given you the context, we need to achieve what I was talking about. You want to counter all the proxies, you look for ways to raise the cost to the Iranians. There is one proxy that they will not sacrifice. They'll fight to the rest of their other proxies. They won't sacrifice Hezbollah. Hezbollah is too important to them. They're the equivalent of their foreign legion. Their 150,000 rockets are basically the deterrent against Israel attacking the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. You know, the more they see that the price to them could go up, the more they will be much more cautious in terms of what they do. Organizing a regional coalition so that we integrate everybody into the central command, which they are. We do the kinds of exercises that make it clear. We'll carry out certain kinds of strikes. We create a regional integrated air and missile defense so you can blunt threats that the Iranians can make with either drones, cruise missiles, or ballistic missiles. You make it very clear where they will pay a price, where there's a risk of escalation. We have to stop the posture of acting as if we fear escalation. We want them to fear escalation. Every time we say we don't want to escalate, don't say anything. Let the silence play on their unease. Every time you say we don't want escalation, you're telling them it's okay for them to escalate. So we have to change the way we talk about it. We have to organize this kind of regional coalition. The Saudi normalization with Israel could be a critical part of that because it helps to ensure you produce a regional coalition. Right now, you have what is a quasi-coalition of Russia and Iran with China sort of connected to them. China, I think, can be separated from them. We need to have the counter to that. And it's a coalition of those who actually want to build resilient societies, effective governance, and the like. So, yes, there needs to be a strategy for the region, and I'm afraid we have to become much more threatening on their posture on the nuclear issue. Right now, they have to understand that if we see them crossing the threshold, we will destroy their entire nuclear infrastructure. They've invested at least $100 billion over the years in this. They need to know they can lose that entire investment. We need to communicate that privately. We need to make it clear publicly. We need to reinforce it with the kinds of exercises in the region that mean we're rehearsing what we would do if we see them cross that.
So let me pivot or try to the questions of participants, of which there's roughly 350,000. But in so doing, let me ask you about something you just said, which someone has raised. And that is, it sounds as though, put simply, you feel as though the administration is sending counterproductive messages to Iran, messages which are very difficult or can be difficult to reverse once they have been received. Specifically, I hear you saying that a message of more than preparedness to be robust in our responses. That message needs to be ratcheted up considerably and sooner rather than later.
Look, what we've seen with the administration, once they responded after the killing of the 3 soldiers, the response hitting 85 targets, to say it got the Iranian attention would be an understatement. As I said, you go from 166 attacks to 0. They suddenly realized this was too risky for them. Earlier, look, I understand there's a climate where we don't want to see escalation in the region. It's true. I don't want to see escalation in the region, but you also have to think carefully about how your words are received. Rather than saying that, don't say anything. Doesn't mean you're looking for escalation, but the Iranians need to be uncertain about what can happen. As an old student of Thomas Schelling, I mean, he wasn't my professor, but I read all of his books. He used to talk about a threat that leaves something to chance. It creates a fear that you don't want, if you're an adversary, you don't want to take that first step because you're not quite sure where it's going to lead. I think that look, to be fair, I understand all the pressures this administration is under because of its readiness to stand by Israel and what's happened to its own base. And I understand the high cost of that. And I understand they don't want to look like they're beating the war drums in the Middle East. I understand all that. And my basic view is, I think for the remainder of this year, we can probably do what we're doing. If there's a second Biden term, the approach towards the Iranian nuclear issue is going to have to change. And it's going to have to become much more threatening than it is right now.
Let me ask you about Saudi Arabia, since you mentioned it. Some of us today are old enough to remember the Memorex commercial, "Is it real or is it Memorex?" You are not among them. But there's a lot of discussion about normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Is it real or is it Memorex?
First of all, I had Memorex, but yes, it's real. Look, you look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has undergone a social revolution. If you go to Saudi Arabia today, you will see men and women together. You can go to concerts. The Wahhabis outlawed music. Now they have concerts in the desert that draw 750,000 people. If you go to Riyadh and you want to get an Uber, pretty good chance your driver will be a woman. This is a country that's being transformed. And it's being transformed not because it's as a favor to anybody. It's being transformed because Mohammed bin Salman has a vision of what Saudi Arabia has to become. It has to be a digitally based economy. He wants it to be a leader in the world when it comes to renewable energy. He wants it to be a leader in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. He wants to actually be able to export that in place of oil, because oil at some point will run out. So he looks at Israel as not only not being an enemy, he looked at Israel as having an economy that is the startup nation. He wants this to be increasingly the case within Saudi Arabia. Before October 7th, what he required on the Palestinians was less than what he requires today. Because the fact is, most of his public, which is younger than him, 70% of his public is under the age of 35. And I think he understood that prior to October 7th, they were not riveted on the Palestinians. Now, what's happened in Gaza, because you see the daily images of the suffering there. It's like we have two different universes. The Israelis are absorbed, for understandable reasons, by their own profound sense of loss and also their profound sense of insecurity. But they're not seeing what's going on in Gaza. It's like they can't, their own pain is so great that it's not possible to absorb someone else's pain. But the whole Arab world, and unfortunately most of the rest of the world, is all seeing all these images of death and destruction within Gaza. So it's affected the Saudis, affected their public. And it doesn't mean they won't pursue this. They won't try to pursue it until this war is over, or at least until you're in phase 4, where the Israelis are out of Gaza, even if they may be doing, more commando kinds of operations. Number one. Number two, they want to be able to say to their public, look, we achieved something for the Palestinians that wasn't achieved before. And will we get to that this year? I don't know. A lot depends upon how soon we get either to phase 4, where Israel feels it can withdraw from Gaza. Again, Israel find it easier to withdraw from Gaza if it has done more to set the stage so that there's not a vacuum. And then there becomes a potential, and this is again a kind of testament to how much things have changed. You have a number of Arab states, including the Emirates, who are prepared to play a role on the ground. As I said, they're already a field hospital for automated bakeries, already providing security for that. They're prepared to do much more, provided they see there's kind of a path towards reform in the PA, because they want a bridge to something. They don't want to go in a big way if there's a bridge to nowhere, because there's no built-in alternative to Hamas. But if there is an alternative to Hamas, we could end up seeing Arab states play a role with the Palestinians we've long sought but never seen. Meaning where they assume some responsibility for Palestinians, something they've never done. During, when I was negotiating, whenever I would try to get them to do things, in the end, they wouldn't do it, because they were always afraid that Yasser Arafat would say, they're trying to force us to surrender our national rights. And no one was prepared to stand up to that. Well, Yasser Arafat had a kind of credibility in a way that Abu Mazen doesn't. So I'm not saying they want to leap to this, but the point is they're prepared to play a role, but they need to see that there is a pathway here. And the pathway is creating an alternative, not leaving a vacuum. They don't want to be the ones that have to go in on their own and fill the vacuum, but also creating an approach where they can help play a role with regard to that vacuum, but they know that it's not a permanent one, because there can be a Palestinian replacement for Hamas.
We have some questions about UNRWA, which I want to get to, but I want to ask you quickly to provide the title of the book and when it is coming out.
Well, I said I was just about finished writing it. Finished writing a book doesn't mean it's the same as publishing the book. It is Oxford University Press, but it's I still have I have another 3 weeks to finish writing, and then it'll be a year, because that's typically it'll be a year. So a year from now, and the book will be called Statecraft 2.0.
Thank you for that. UNRWA, the Israelis argue that it's effectively an arm of Hamas. UNRWA denies it. Where do you come out on the role that UNRWA plays, and who is closer to the truth?
UNRWA is, for the time being, UNRWA is doing what no one else can do. So when I say that, I would like to see us phase out UNRWA. It's not realistic to phase it out in the current context, but over time, we should phase it out. There should be, first of all, UNRWA should not be the deliverer of food. UNRWA was providing about 60% of the meals in Gaza before October 7th. That should be the World Food Program, not UNRWA. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that should be the focal point for Palestinian refugees, especially those who are in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Shouldn't be UNRWA. But you can't go cold turkey on this. You have to create a process of change. Part of the reform has to be a needs-based definition of who gets assistance. And there hasn't been that. UNRWA the Palestinians are the only ones in the world that are handled by UNRWA. No one else is who's a refugee. So this should be phased out over time. It's an anachronism, and it's part of a process designed to keep the issue of the Palestinian refugees alive, not to settle it. Think about now. No one has ever been prepared to rebuild the refugee camps. Well, think about, in Gaza now, you have no choice, given the level of destruction. So, for those who say cut off UNRWA now, that's a mistake. It's a mistake, not only for Gaza, but also for the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon. You can't do that. You can't simply switch it off. But there needs to be, when this is over, there needs to be a pathway that is created away from UNRWA.
Let me ask you about that, and this, I guess, will be the last question that I'll ask you. Keeping on the is it real or is it Memorex theme, you hear about the prospect of the Gulf nations investing billions of dollars, it would take billions of dollars, to reconstruct Gaza and to enable it to get to where the Israelis wanted it to be when they withdrew almost 20 years ago. But there have been these kind of mini events, and they've been followed by some measure of investment, much less than had been promised, and certainly did not result in the money being used in the way that most people here would have preferred to see it used. So how realistic is it when people talk about, look, the day after, the decade after will involve tons of investment by the Saudis and the Gulf states and so forth. And finally, those countries will take a more vigorous, constructive, generous role in Gaza?
I think it has to be part of an international approach, and I think it has to be based on a formula, and the formula is guaranteed demilitarization for reconstruction, with mechanisms to ensure that the material is monitored every step of the way, from the time it enters Gaza to where it is stored to its end use. There also has to be a premise that there'll be no investment in Gaza reconstruction if Hamas is in control. And if these are the premises, and then you construct following the humanitarian board or mechanism I want should basically be a precursor to developing the mechanisms I was just describing. It means over time, you're talking about a transition that will take several years at a minimum. And so it proves itself. It needs to prove itself. And you need to see that, in fact, when I gave a talk in Gaza after Sharon announced he was withdrawing, before he did, to a couple hundred Palestinians. And I said, Palestinians have never controlled their own destiny. In 1948, basically, the Arabs said, we'll take care of it. Arafat told me when we were at Camp David that he wanted to go to the original Camp David in 1978. But the Soviets and Syrians said no. So I said, when I spoke, I said, you have a chance. Israel's getting out 100%. You turn Gaza into Singapore, or something like Singapore. Now, it won't just be the international community, it'll be Israelis who'll say, why not the West Bank? But you turn it into a platform for attacks against Israel, who's going to say, let's take that failed model and apply it? So the whole point here is there's been a devastation. The level of destruction is extraordinary in Gaza right now. So there is an opportunity, but the opportunity has to look it cannot be what we saw after 2005. And that's why there has to be a different structure set up. It has to evolve. Palestinians who come in have to have a set of, have to be prepared to prove that they're about creating progress for Palestinians and not about focusing all their efforts and wherewithal and capability on fighting Israel. Think about what Hamas did, and I'll pause, I'll stop. Hamas built 400 miles of tunnels. It used 30,000 tons of cement, concrete, probably 10,000 tons of metal, enormous amounts of electrical wiring, wood, piping. All that could have been used above ground. None of it was used above ground. The tunnels themselves could have been a form of protection for the Palestinians who live in Gaza. None of it was. Hamas had not the slightest interest of advancing the well-being of Palestinians. It had only one purpose: mukawama, resistance. That's what defines it. And it cannot be, when this is over, it cannot be in a position where it can reconstitute itself. It cannot be in a position where Gaza can be remilitarized, and it cannot be running Gaza. And that, by the way, is Israel's success. When I hear the slogan "total victory," it means nothing. Does total victory mean you're going to get every Hamas in Gaza? No way. You're going to disarm every Hamas person who has an arm? No way. But you can focus on what you can achieve. And demilitarization and ensuring that there can't be remilitarization, that is an achievable objective.
I'm going to just steal one more very quick question. Sorry about this to everybody. Rafa, will there be some kind of meaningful operation, do you think? And are the Israelis correct that some degree of operation is necessary?
The answer is yes, because you still have 4 battalions there. But even if you take care of those 4 battalions, if you don't create probably an understanding brokered by us between Egypt and Israel, Gaza was maybe an open air prison for the Palestinians who lived there, but it was not an open air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed, and most of it came underground through that border. So even if you take care of the battalions, you still have to deal with that border. I would say, that border is where so much of the smuggling went on. Those battalions that are there, they were the smuggling battalions. So they're not necessarily the tip of the spear, the most effective of the Hamas battalions, but that doesn't mean you can ignore them. But you can't go in when there's 1.3 million people there. And it's fine for Israel to say we're going to have evacuation plans, but where are they? You keep saying you want to go do Rafah. If you're going to do Rafah, you should, and you really want to send a signal to Hamas that you're going to do it, Hamas should see that all the evacuation is taking place. So long as they don't see any evacuation, whatever the words are from the prime minister, why would they believe it? So in the end of the day, there's going to have to be some kind of operation there that's going to have to be even on the ground. But you're going to have to evacuate people from there. They're going to have to be absorbed where they go. And then, even then, it's not going to look like what a lot of the other fighting involved. It may not be this highly targeted, just go for individuals the way the administration seems to think, but it also isn't going to be an all-out onslaught with a lot of aerial bombardment.
So let me turn it back to Naomi, but not before saying what is self-evident, which is that thousands of us who will have watched this over the next couple of days are extremely grateful to you. There isn't anybody, any place who is the gold standard of analysis of this region the way that you are. It's extraordinarily generous of you to have spent this time. And I know I speak for thousands of people now who, when I say, go hurry up with that book.
Agreed.
I'm motivated.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ross. I remember reading your books for decades as well in college and beyond. So thank you for all the work you've done, not only in your writing, but in your diplomacy and continue to this day. And we thank you again for your time and your generosity in joining us for today's program. Thank you again to Jeff for hosting us. Thank you to Saul Ewing for sponsoring this series. And thank you to Rabbi Arthur Weiner and the JCC of Paramus, Congregation Beth Tikva, New Jersey, for being another sponsor of our webinars. As I said, we've gotten hundreds of questions in the chat on Zoom and on Facebook Live. I apologize to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. We would need probably days to answer all of them. If you'd like to follow up with us, please send them to info@asuh.org. Please also follow us across social media, sign up for our newsletters on our website. Again, for those who are looking to give back to University of Haifa at this time, during our urgent needs, and for our student soldiers who have been serving and defending Israel, you can do so at asuh.org/donate. Of course, you know that supporters of University of Haifa are critical partners always, but also especially during this challenging time for all of us and for the state of Israel. Our next webinar will be in a couple of weeks. You'll be getting a notification about that in our newsletters, as well as on our social media and our website. We will be hosting Abram Foxman, the former national director of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, on April 10th. You'll get that information soon. And thank you again to all of our many viewers. You'll get a recording of this webinar soon in your inbox as well to rewatch and to share with anyone who would like to view it. So thank you again to our very active and engaged audience. And thank you again to Jeff and to Ambassador Ross. We appreciate it.